Hear ye. This is Naval Actions weekly update, and I am your host, Lars Kjær. I would first take this opportunity to apologize for having been sick these past couple of weeks. So this is actually a late take on the Naval Actions RVR in the war server. And I would like to apologize for another thing, and that is for forgetting the War of Bahamas in the last video. But a great shout out to Takahitsu Gaming for reminding me that there's actually a bloody heated war in the Bahamas, and I'll try to cover it today as well. But first off, some general states of the RVR. There's been some developments that I think everybody should be mindful of, and which will affect the coming weeks probably, and if not, a couple of months. The first thing is that the Sweden has caved in to the Russian pressure. They've surrendered, and this has, of course, a huge impact of the server population. It has a huge impact on the RVR of the server, especially for the Russians, ironically enough, because the Russians are the bear of the server. They are the Zerg, so to speak, and when Sweden is out of the picture, there's no one really able to challenge them in RVR, which the Prussians belatedly found out, but I'll get back to that one. To some respect, of course, being Denmark-Norway player, I kind of like the idea that we won the war against the Swedes, but the fact is that there's no winners in that war, there's only losers, which has been prevalent in a lot of issues. One of them is the sheer amount of toxicity that arises from RVR between the player communities. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I will go into later, but I honestly don't see anyone winning these wars. The effect on the server and the effect on the players are simply too large. It denigrates people to abusing alts, abusing tactics that would otherwise have been seen unfair or unsportsmanlike, like hiding behind timers, making port battles without showing up. Griefing and screening is apparently a new thing that I need to read up on, because I've never actually experienced griefing and screening. I've experienced some really fun port battle screenings, but again, that's something I will come back to. But in general, I think this is actually a shame for the server's development in total, because we kind of need the wars. It's a war server, and the content in the game is very limited, especially if you are a casual player. Then there's really not a lot you can do. So as for the general server population and the health of the server, I think we need these great confrontations between nations. One thing that is important to keep in mind is that, of course, Russia won't be the Zerg at all times. We've seen Zergs come and go. We saw the Brits being a Zerg at one point. We saw Sweden be a Zerg at another point. We've seen Russia, of course, being a Zerg nation. We've seen the pirates being a Zerg nation. Back in the early days of the server, we even had a Dutch, if not Zerg, but a powerful Dutch fleet that was able to actually affect things on the server. So we've seen Zergs come and go before, and why do they go? Well, at some point it becomes a little bit boring. You don't get a lot of content. So what do? Well, you switch to a nation where you can get content, basically. And it's never fun being part of the top dog, because, well, it is for some players, but for the majority of the competitive-minded players in Naval Action, there's really not a lot of fun in it, simply because why play a game that you've already won? So we will see Russia split up at some point. I would suspect either that, or we would see a new Grand Alliance against the Russians this time around, hopefully with a little bit more diplomatic players and a little bit more open-minded players, but never mind that. But the general state of RVR is that the two great confrontations has been negated. So what's left is a bunch of minor tidying up to do, and some minor wars, among others, the Pirates versus the Brits, the Spanish versus the Brits, Denmark-Norway. I don't know if we can call it a war, but there's been a couple of port battles against the French. But basically, it's minor confrontations that doesn't really affect the player base, and for that part, I think it's a very healthy development. As for the terms of the peace treaty between the Swedes and the Russians, I won't go into that many details. What is mostly important, of course, is that the Swedes are going to lose San Juan, which we see up here. It's been marked on the map, but basically the entire area that has been marked is ports that the Swedes are giving up. Some are going to the Danes, some are going to the Russians, and of course, I've said it before, we fight whoever holds San Juan. So what will happen in the future is anyone's guess, but my estimate is that San Juan will be given to the Danes, but there has been another development that may affect that. Basically, Hat Island will hopefully be a place where Danes and Swedes can have some fun port battles without all the toxicity and all the drama that has been going on lately. But basically, what has happened lately is that, of course, you know the story. There's been a lot of shit being thrown around between the nations and the communities, and in that respect, I really dislike RVR because it brings out the worst in people. And the reason for this will be touched when we come to the patch notes that will be in the forthcoming patches. But right now, Sweden lost, Russia is taking the ports, and Denmark are getting basically what was their core area back. That's always been the issue between Denmark and Sweden. We are so closely situated to one another that we either work together or end up in a confrontation where nobody wins, and that has been the experience for the past 5 years or something like that. It's always been like that. But that's basically the important gist of the treaty between the Russians and the Swedes. What's most important is, of course, that the Swedes are losing their main crafting port, San Juan. They have two other 50-point ports, and with the forthcoming patches, they will most likely have two 55-point ports in close proximity to Gustavia. If I were a gambling man, I would say that they would increase the Philipsburg's point tally to at least 55, simply because Philipsburg is way inside the protected area of the Swedish privateer zone. So it's gonna be impossible to prevent them from getting supplies into Philipsburg, and it will be impossible to actually take back Philipsburg if anybody wants to wage war against the Swedes. So in my estimate, we will see a resurgent Sweden in a couple of weeks. As for some of the a little bit more interesting things, there has been a war in the Bahamas, and as I started out saying, I actually forgot the war in Bahamas in the last roundup. But it is, in my opinion, one of the more interesting places, because basically the pirates have won the war of the East South Cay. So now they've been pushing towards Nassau, which is, of course, a 55-point port. And there's two developments that I think it's kind of interesting. One is that the Russians are kind of shoring up their defenses by handing over the ports to the Americans. The other thing is that the Americans haven't actually been able to hold on to those ports. So right now it's kind of in a stalemate where the Russians don't want to invest the resources needed to actually finish the pirates in that area. And the other thing is that the Americans are unable to actually push back the pirates back to the eastern side of South Cay, perhaps even further towards the Dead Man's Cay. But right now it's kind of in a standoff between the two sides. The Americans, it's my estimation that they need the Russian support, and the Russians has so many front lines that they are unwilling to invest the amount of resources needed to actually win that war, especially because after the Swedes integrated a new dogma in RVR, a new meta, basically everybody comes in privateer ships because they've buffed the privateers' armaments to 24-pounder carronades, which is, of course, abundantly realistic that the ship would, of course, never be torn apart by the recoil. That's great. It's a really a historically minded game. But that's no fault of the Swedes, by the way. But they just took advantage of it first, and now everybody in the shallows are using privateers and Grins. And the thing about that is, first of all, if you take a 55-point privateer, you can basically craft it for free. It's a cheap throwaway ship, so you can keep crafting until you get a gold or purple ship, and then you get 5 upgrade slots and trim, or 4 upgrade slots and a trim, or 5 upgrade slots without the trim. And that means that you can basically kit it out with some insane modules it requires a 25-man job all of a sudden in the shallow water port battles, which was one of the things that I actually liked about shallow water port battles, because you could get some fun 8 versus 8 or 10 versus 10, 12 versus 12. Now you need 25 versus 25 in order to be competitive, and that's it's just not as fun, in my opinion. I mean, I don't mind larger groups, but for that you had the bigger port battles, you had the capital port battles. Now everything needs to be at least 15 versus 15, and it's a shame, really. But the Pirates isn't only invested in the Bahamas. Actually, one of the most active Avian nations at the moment is actually the Pirates, because the Pirates have also taken to attacking the Brits. The Brits has Santiago de Cuba, and of course the Pirates want a 55-point port. That's Santiago de Cuba. Where can they get one? Well, they can't really take Nassau because that's defended by the Russians. So where do they go? Well, the weak man on the server is Great Britain. And so let's poke fun of the Great British, especially because the Lur clan, who's sitting on Santiago de Cuba, is having some confrontations with a lot of the other British clans, which means that Great Britain is divided. To quote Abraham Lincoln, a house divided cannot stand. So, in my estimation at least, unless the Brits pull their shit together and work together as a nation, at some point they're going to lose Santiago de Cuba, simply because the Pirates does have a very organized fleet. The WTF clan is one of the better port battle fleets and one of the better clans in terms of organization. I rarely see them hunting by themselves, but that shows that they have a community where they actually work together. So Santiago de Cuba is their main target of, and the obtainable target of conquest. I don't think that the Pirates will be able to take Nassau, and even if they take Nassau, they won't be able to keep it. That's the problem with the shallow water port battles. If you can't field continuously a 25-man fleet, you will always at a risk of losing a port simply by not having the numbers to compete in that port battle. And with Trout Cay so close to Nassau, you really need the numbers to shore up the defenses. Santiago de Cuba, on the other hand, is a port that you can insulate simply by taking the ports around Santiago de Cuba, and that way you can always field a port battle defense, and you have a little bit more warning before they actually can go for Santiago de Cuba. Sorry. But this isn't the only war that the Brits are forced to contend with, because, as I said, the Brits are internally divided. We still have some remnants of the BSTD clan in the British nation, and the Lur clan doesn't really like the BSTD guys, and vice versa. So what has the Lur clan done? Well, they have moved some of their alts to Spain in order to continue a war by proxy, basically, against the BSTD, this has resorted to some shenanigans. From my understanding, Omoa was taken by basically some players in the Omoa port battle throwing the game because they were actually supportive of Lur. It's not an abuse, and it's not really a tribunal case matter, simply because alts are allowed. That's one thing, and the other thing is that what is really at stake here is inter-clan diplomacy, where one clan is basically buying out another clan's ports. But I have to say that all these shenanigans about basically robbing a port, not by winning the port in the port battle, but by making people throw the game, so to speak. It's it's basically cowards tactics. It's right up there on par with setting port battles without attending or hiding behind timers. It's basically the coward's tactic, because if you can't take the port in a contested port battle, I mean, it's just embarrassing, really. But that being said, I don't really think that in that conflict anyone can point the blame finger, especially not considering the alts, since at this point most players, at least most RVR players, if not all RVR players, has alts either for econ purposes like I do, or for actually being able to attend more port battles in different nations. And that's one of the issues that is actually being addressed with the forthcoming patch. But let's wait with that. But at the moment, the Brits are really being pushed from both sides. The pirates on one side, that's a little bit more honest war, from what I can gather, and you have the Spanish-Brit war, which is kind of an underhanded roguish war, where the main problem really is that it's an internal dispute in the British nation. It's one of the issues that actually stems from clans having power in the nation. And you could argue that one way to solve these inter-clan wars, which is, I mean, the toxicity levels between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden could rise to kind of unhealthy levels, but when it comes to inter-clan wars in nations, the toxicity level just goes through the roof, and it's one of the things that one could argue that if clans had less say on the matters of the nation, it would improve the toxicity level. But one could also point out that it would also mean that the game lost some of its sense of what's the right word? Of course, the drama, but also the sense of urgency, the sense of importance. One can't help but admit that the game, for all its faults and flaws, it really provokes emotions in the player base, and some of these emotions are continuously tied to the community that you're playing with, and that is the clan, not the nation. Especially since the nation never really seems to agree on much. Which goes doubly so for Great Britain. It has never really been a unified nation, simply because its player base is so large, and the more players you have, the less unity is able to be achieved, simply because of the amount of minds. People aren't drones, they do actually think for themselves, and they don't always agree. But moving on, since Sweden lost the war against the Russians, and while I was sick, of course, Sweden had to surrender while I was sick, because they couldn't wait until I was back in a port battle so I could say that I had something to do with it. No, but that's okay, I'm not bitter at all. But one development that actually surprised me a little bit, because Prussia was playing it cautiously. They were weighing up their options. They were not really committing to anything in terms of RVR. And basically, the week where Sweden surrendered, Prussia threw their lot into the Swedish camp, which must stand as one of the monumentally poor decisions in the game ever. And it's a little bit strange that Sweden didn't even inform Prussia that they were considering surrendering to the Russians, because it's kind of a dick move to surrender the same week that you convince an ally to throw in their game time and their fleets in your favor. But never mind that. The Prussians the Prussians can sit by themselves and have a poor taste in their mouth about the Swedish diplomacy, but when all is said and done, there has been no one to blame but themselves, and they were actually already going to a situation where they could either pull back from their war against the Dutch or accept that they would be coming into a conflict with the Russians as well, simply because the Dutch flipped from being an ally of the Swedes to becoming an ally of the Russians, and at that point, it would be foolish to consider a war between the Prussians and the Dutch in isolation. So what has happened is that Sweden surrendered, and that put Prussia in an untenable position. I really don't disagree with the Prussians' leadership that the war would be lost now that they were at war with the Russians alone. The Prussians can perhaps field 2 port battles on a very good day, 2 port battle fleets, that is. The sheer number of enemies that the Prussians were standing against meant that the war would already be a foregone conclusion. So what have the Prussians done to minimize their losses in a war that was already lost? Well, they switched their Lama clan, which was a British clan, if you remember, to Russia. And now they're taking their own ports with their Alt clan in order to keep them safe from the Russians, and at the same time allow them to attack Russians' allies with impunity, because of course they can. This is kind of a big move, but at the same time I have to give them credit. They are finding solutions when no solutions were to be had. It's a flaw in the mechanics, basically. And it's one of the things that I think is that we as a player base should really consider. There's a lot of flaws in the RVR system. One of them is that it is so punitive to lose a war. The Sweden lost their main crafting port, which they took from the Danes. I don't want to go into the shenanigans about the takeover, but basically the problem is that if you don't have a 55-point port, you can't craft. If you can't craft, you can't do RVR. If you can't do RVR, you're basically put on the sideline of a lot of the content of the server. So I actually understand why the Prussians are doing what they're doing. I think it's a little bit of a dick move. Again, if you can't hold the port on your own, if you can't actually contest the port battle, well, then you shouldn't have it. I mean, it's unsportsmanlike is probably the right word. But the fact is that the RVR mechanics are basically unsportsmanlike. They don't promote a fair contest between fleets. It promotes the best equipped fleet. There is no skill in the skill-based RVR. Someone once told me that diplomacy is a skill too, and in that case you could say that Prussia has lost significantly due to poor diplomacy. But the truth is that it should be the port battle fleet's skill and the skill of the command of the port battle fleet that decides the port battle. It shouldn't be because you have the better ship, because you have the better equipment, and the opposing side can't get that same equipment. That kind of elitism is basically ruining anything, considering anything that could be called a sportsmanlike conduct or a sportsmanlike game. It's basically rigging the contest in favor of one side. So I can understand the importance of the crafting ports, especially because after Russia entered the fray against Prussia, and after Sweden removed themselves, Prussia has been steadily losing ground, not just to the Russians, but also to the Dutch. If we look at this area, while I was sick, we saw an advance of the Prussians towards Porto Cabello, and the Prussians were basically annihilating the Dutch. Now the Prussians are being pushed back towards Guayana, and the question is basically how long can the Prussians last in this area? I'm not saying that they're going to be removed that easily, but what is probably going to be contested is the area that I've marked on the map with the yellow box. It's the Dutch who are in the offensive and the Prussians who are on the defense. And it's always harder to be on the defensive side because, of course, defensive port battles are, it has to be said, it's easier to win a defensive port battle than it is to win an offensive port battle, usually, depending on the wind, but that's another discussion. But basically, when you're on the defending side, the attacker decides where to attack and when to attack, which means that you can decide what wind you want for the port battle if you care enough to actually consider that aspect. You can decide where to attack from, and you can decide which ports to attack. The solution could, of course, be to go on the offensive, but the fact is that once you're on the defensive foot, you can do hostility, but especially when your numbers are limited, your resources are limited, and that means that you're limited to defensive port battles rather than offensive port battles, offensive strategies. So right now, I'd say that Prussia lost the war, also the war with the Dutch, and their solution has been basically to keep Santo Domingo safe by taking Santo Domingo with the Russian alt clan. Santo Domingo, of course, is a 55-point port. It's also one of the least defensive ports in of the 55-point ports, partly due to its close proximity to Lamona, and partly because of the circle layout of the Santo Domingo port. What is interesting here is that the Prussians are actually gambling that they can take Santo Domingo without losing it again. And there's a cost associated to losing a port. You have to rebuild the port after losing the port. So that means that if the Prussians doesn't find a solution, they will end up fighting, and this is where it becomes really, really interesting. They will end up fighting the Red Clan's alts in Denmark, Norway, of all things. So, yeah, it's becoming more and more a war by proxy in this game rather than a genuine war. So let's turn to something a little bit more interesting, because right now the Prussians are basically reeling. They're trying to survive, but what's it called? The Prussians basically attacked Denmark, Norway in Cabo de la Vela, but again, it's this war by proxy that really shows some of the flaws of the RVR. The Prussians wouldn't basically switch to Russia and attack Denmark, Norway if they felt that they could attack and or at least compete in a different setting. So they do what they feel that they have to, and we shouldn't blame players for poor mechanics. What we should do is ask why is it so important to have alts? Why do we have to have alt clans in order to be able to compete in RVR? Well, the solution is very simple. It's because ports matters. The more ports matters, the more players will steal, cheat, and lie in order to keep those ports. And the game as a whole becomes less than what it could have been, simply because the sheer significance that you put on crafting ports. I'll be jumping on towards Denmark, Norway, and France. Denmark, Norway attacked Cano-Macareo. The reason for this attack is, of course, that we need to move past Cano-Macareo, Naparima, Pedernales in order to get up to Guayara. I can't pronounce it. Gira and Galdonas in order to actually be able to fight the Prussians. We could, of course, attack Higei or the Santo Domingo region, but right now the Prussians are doing it for us, and ironically enough, already pulling down Santo Domingo. Once they have taken over the region, I suspect that the Red Clan will take on the offensive with their alt clans, because that's what we do now in this game. But the French actually screened us out at Cano-Macareo. I had a very fun screening battle, and the French. It was a nice battle where, for a long time, I've been fighting battles where people were hurling insults in the chat. I haven't been an angel there either. The toxicity levels was very through the roof with the Swedes, but this battle was a nice contest between, at least in terms of BR, evenly matched teams. The French had a lot of redoubtables on their side, and what really shows is the difference between a DLC ship, even if you put the seasoned woods on it, and crafted port battleships. The crafted port battleships, I didn't have the best modules on it because as I said, I don't know if I said it, but I'm not really an RVR player. I don't really want to do the grind in order to do RVR, which means that, I've got plenty of Northern Master Carpenters. I'm just too cheap to actually use them. I've got plenty of Cartagena Corkin refits. I've got plenty of French gunnery sergeants. Basically, I've got the stores to do RVR, but I'm too cheap to actually do it. And I think that a lot of players, especially casual players, are thinking the same. They're basically building up stockpiles of modules, but when it comes down to it, they really don't want to use them because, it doesn't really matter that much. But the battle was a very fun battle, and of course I could be a little bit annoyed that we were screened out, but I like the screening battles, and it should be a tactic of the defensive side to call on its allies, to call on its to call on the players that actually supports them, and screen out an enemy port battle fleet. If I were to come with a slightly historical example, in the 7-year war between France and Great Britain, 1756 to 1764, I believe, at the early stages of the war, the French had a lot of naval successes, not in terms of winning grand battles against the Brits, because they didn't really. There was a single one at Monaco where the French didn't really win the fleet engagement, but they managed to push out the British Admiral John Byng, and he eventually ended up getting shot, which because of negligence of duty, because it meant that Minorca was lost to the French at the early stage of the war. But the thing that I'm thinking about, and by the way, that could be considered a screening battle, because the French land army that was besieging I can't remember what the castle was called on the island, but if it had been deprived of supplies, it would have been unable to continue the siege and would have to be withdrawn. Instead, the French won that battle, and they were able to finish the siege. The castle was lost, and so the entire island was occupied by the French. But what I'm thinking about is actually Louisburg, which was an object of British conquest at a very early stage of the war, and the French had, due to the topography in Canada and the weather in Canada, it's very difficult to keep a fleet on station in and around Halifax and Newfoundland. So what the French did was basically that they sent a fleet of line ships to Louisburg at an early stage of the campaign. They managed to enter the port of Louisburg very early on, which meant that when the British fleet that was sent to take Louisburg arrived, they saw that there were already French defenders inside of the port, which meant that they would have no choice but to give up the conquest of Louisburg for that campaigning year, which can be roughly equivalent to the screening battles here in the game. It should be possible to actually screen out the opponent from a port battle. I liked the battle. Even despite the fact that we didn't get into the port battle, we had a very fun battle where we killed a lot of French players. As I said, the Redoubtable is... there's been a lot of talk on the forums about the Redoubtable being OP. That's a boatload of BS. It's anyone who sails the Redoubtables and states that that loses to a Redoubtable and states that it's OP. It's not the player that... it's not the ship that's OP. They just came up against a player that was better than them, because the Redoubtable is by far an average third rate. And the reason why I'm saying this is that the port bonuses are randomized. If there had been no port bonus, I would have a tendency not to agree necessarily, but I would come to the point where I would say, okay, there is one thing about the Redoubtable that is OP, and that is the fact that you don't need to grind doubloons in order to get it to the third-rate ship of the line. That is actually the very reason why it's overpowered. It's the fact that you don't have to do a grind in order to get a line ship that can do screening battles. But it was... in a battle against a coordinated fleet, you get smashed, even if you're in a Redoubtable. Perhaps especially because you're in a Redoubtable. But never mind that, let's go on, because there's one thing that I would like to discuss as the final bit. I'm coming up on a little bit more than half an hour, so I'll try to keep this short. But with the forthcoming patch notes, there's a lot of things in the patch notes that I need to address. One of them is that now you will be able to invest in port bonuses, not just so that you can get ship bonuses, but you can increase the amount of points tally of a port. Now, this sounds all well and good because it means that there will be more Franken ships about. It will be basically the elitism of the port battle fleets, of the port bonuses, will be reduced. It won't be removed, but it will be reduced. But the problem I have with this is that when you can increase the point tally of a port, it means that you can use those points for more than just, for example, putting it into the ship bonuses. You can also put it into resources, which means that if you're an open world player like me, I prefer sailing around for PvP. I prefer sailing around and killing people, basically. But in order to do so, you need targets in the open world. And where do those targets come from? Well, there's three kinds of targets. There are other hunters, which is the most fun battles you get. Then there's the traders, which are trading resources or trading trade commodities in order to make money so that they can pull out more stuff from the farms. And those traders are important because the course de guerre, basically the war against traders, the war against enemy resources. When you're in a small nation, how do you compete with a bigger nation? Well, you can't compete in port battles. So how do you compete otherwise? Well, you can make it so frustratingly annoying that the opposing side just thinks, okay, let's come to an agreement so that we can get this annoyance away from us. That will be reduced, if not entirely eliminated, with this forthcoming patch. And it has already been almost eliminated, because if we just take Denmark-Norway as an example, St. Johan was the crafting port of Denmark-Norway. So how do we get the resources for St. Johan? Well, we either build up Fajardo so that you can get all basic resources in Fajardo, and perhaps a Vikesen Pasai. That way you only have a little triangle area where you need to gather your supplies and then sail them to St. Johan. A little short trip, and unless you're really unlucky, then you will be attacked by a hunter like myself without anybody being able to help you. But most of the time you will have plenty of assistance in the ports or already out at sea, because that's what organized clans do. They convoy their ships into St. Johan, so it's a little short trip that takes about 10 minutes. With this new adjustment to the port bonus system, if I were the deciding factor, I would say, okay, let's build up, for example, Road Town, which is in the middle of this picture. And I'm taking Denmark-Norway as an example, but keep in mind, Philipsburg is way inside of the privateer zone of the Swedes. So they have an even easier extent to get their resources, but let's wait with that. Road Town, we build up Road Town to the point where it's a 55-point port. We build it up out for ship crafting. Why do we do that? Well, Spanish Town, which is the regional capital, and therefore a place where you can offload trading resources and get a profit. We built that up to a 55-point port as well, and fill it with basic resources, and then we fill it with teak and white oak, or whatever the new woods that comes with is used in crafting, or whatever is the new meta, so to speak. So we fill it out with those woods, and then we only have one port that is less than 3 minutes sails from Road Town, which means literally that Danes will be able to jump out of Spanish Town, sail to Road Town without being able to be tagged by a hunter like myself. It means that it takes away a huge amount of targets on the open sea, which reduces the amount of hunters in the open sea, which again reduces the amount of targets in the open sea. So what is left? Well, there's the third amount of targets, which is the shittiest targets at all, because you can justify attacking traders, Why do they trade? Well, they try to get resources to build up their fleets. So when you're attacking traders, you're basically attacking in RVR. It's part of RVR to attack traders. And it doesn't matter if you're going on a doubloon run or if you're going with resources used in crafting. You need doubloons in order to craft port battleships. You need resources in order to craft port battleships. So traders are legitimate RVR targets and in general just legitimate targets, same as hunters. And I won't say that the last box of targets is legitimate. I'm just saying it's the shittiest battles you get against them, because what's left? Well, there's the PvE players left. There's the players who are going out targeting a PvE ship and just want to do a single PvE battle. They don't plan on doing PvP. They don't want to do PvP, but they are what's left of targets in the open world. And what's more, everybody who has played PvP knows that the AI is crap. So the players that are doing PvE are crappy players. So when they come up against a good PvP player, they always lose. Why? Because they don't know what to do in that battle. I really don't see a lot won by this change in the patch notes. I really don't see how this advances the game. There's been a lot of suggestions on how to solve the problem of the port bonuses. The best solution, in my opinion, would be to remove the port bonuses, rebalance the modules, and so that I don't mind the fact that there should be, for example, some choices that can affect your possibilities in a battle, but they should be balanced. It shouldn't be that, for example, I've talked about it before, the current meta in port battles. If you don't have Northern Master Carpenters on a port battleship, why go to a port battle at all? That's a meta that is unbalanced, and it basically comes down to pen mods, because you want to be able to penetrate the opponent, and repair mods, because you want to be able to out-repair your opponent. That is a meta that is in port battleships. It's the same with PvP ships. At the moment you have metas that is decided by an unbalanced game, basically. And I don't mind that, for example, picking woods. If you, for example, pick teak, you get a decent balance between armor, speed, and maneuverability. Or if you pick mahogany, mahogany is a great pick for a boarding ship, for example, because it has a larger crew resistance, so that means that you lose less crew in other aspects of the boarding. But basically, that's choices where you pick what kind of a strategy do I want to use in a PvP match. And I can accept that. That's part and parcel of the game. It gives nuance to the ships. It gives nuance to the game. What I have a hard time accepting is the port bonuses. I could accept them if it meant that, for example, every crafter could pick their own port bonuses. Why? Because as a hunter, I would prefer speed over, for example, hull armor or gunnery. But first of all, 55-point ports, in my opinion, it's just too many points that you can put into the port bonus system. There should have been a limit on 40 points or 30 points, so that you could get a nuanced ship, but where you had to make trade-offs, where you could pick something, and if you picked that, you were trading off something else. That should be the way we went about it. That should be the route we took. Instead, we've taken the route of having overpowered port battleships that has basically all the bonuses, and now we can get all the resources at the same spot, which means that the amount of targets in open world reduces, and the targets that are left are PvE players who doesn't really want to do PvP. And I'm sorry to say, but I don't see the game being advanced by this. On the contrary, I see the game being reduced by this. There's a huge open world that could have been filled with possibilities, opportunities, options, and what developers are doing are that they are going further towards a lobby-based game, despite the fact that Naval Actions Sea Legends When it was on trial, it didn't really have a lot of players in it. People hate PvP when they're on the weaker side, but they love the idea of the open world and the opportunities that it can entail, which coincidentally includes the possibility of losing in a PvP match. At this point, with these forthcoming patch notes, I really don't see a need for the open world. They could basically go away with the open world, basically have a World of Warship kind of lobby game, and it would be the amount of content that are left in this game, which is incredibly frustrating because there's so many possibilities, there's so many opportunities in this game, and why developers choose to reduce it to a lobby-based PvP game, I don't understand it. One of the other things about screening, I've had my best and my most fun battles as a screener, either screening against someone or screening for someone. And it's gone both ways. I've got my ass handed to me sometimes. I've been able to kill everybody and had a field day and they're going all Rambo on their asses. But basically, the screening battles was a lot of fun, and with the forthcoming patch notes, where you can basically instantly teleport to a port battle, I don't see how that works, by the way, but it throws any sort of realism out of the window, and it removes yet another feature for content in the game. And developers can talk all they want about griefing and screening. I have been in hundreds, literally hundreds of screening battles, and I have never been in a battle that could be considered griefing. I haven't even heard about it before the forthcoming patch notes. So at the moment, I really don't see what developers, what Game Labs wants to do with this game, other than they're basically reducing it more and more to a lobby-based game, so that when the Sea Legends come out, it's a game slated for December 2020. It will basically be a knockoff of Naval Action, perhaps without the grind, and since everybody hates grinding, they will move to the Sea Legends. But they are losing the possibilities of the open world. They're losing the possibilities of what the game could have been, what it could have become, if they haven't already lost it. And I think it's a crying shame, because there's so much potential in this game. Or there was so much potential in this game. But a lack of balance, a lack of consideration for the casual player, and this switch towards a more and more lobby-based game, I mean, it's becoming more and more clear that it's the wrong direction, in my opinion. And it's a direction that I don't really think that the player base wants. If I were to write my ticket, so to speak, on this Naval Action game, I wouldn't be able to recommend it to anybody because of the grinding required. But even if we disregard the grinding required, I would say remove the port bonuses, either remove the modules or balance them out, and have a game where ports doesn't really matter. What matters is the battles. And the battles should be fair and unfair. You should be able to be ganked by 15 players in speedboats, because that's part of the game. And you should be able to go out solo hunting and actually find someone in the open world. Or you should be, I'm trading as well. You should be able to do a trade run where it should be the amount of risk you take that equates the amount of profits you make. At the moment, all you have to do is sail far, which means that every Dane in the game sails from Bermuda to San Juan. I had Swedish alts for that purpose before. Now I get a Russian alt for it. But basically, there's no risk involved. The only risk you take is when you approach either Bermuda or San Juan. Other than that, it's 4 hours of AFK sailing. Yeah. And that's, in my opinion, not content. It's not really worthwhile. So I really hope that these patch notes doesn't involve the development that I think it will. But as I see it, it's the only logical step forward. It's the only logical way. At least if they implement the patch notes as they have been described on the forums. And if that's the case, I really don't see much content in the open world of Naval Action. So on that rather depressing point, I would say thank you for this week and see you next week.